Okay, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about customizing DLP content classifications. My name is Mitch Barnett, and I'm a data protection specialist at McAfee. And so the reason I chose this topic is that a lot of my discussions center around customers with false positives with DLP, as well as trying to accurately classify their data. And so I thought that this would be a good introduction to people that are maybe new to DLP, they're looking at a solution, perhaps they have one and somebody else has moved on from managing it and now it's their responsibility. So going over some of our concepts and the ways we can classify data could be a helpful webinar for us today. And so the reason for why is this important? Obviously, most companies that you're going to work at are going to have some form of sensitive data, and it's important that we can classify that accurately. Of course, if we're not doing a good job with that, we're going to have a lot of false positives, and so the actual quality of the incidents will just kind of go down, and you'll just be inundating yourself and just not have anything that's actionable. Of course, as sensitive information leaves your environment, you're going to have some sort of legal liability either to your own employees or to the customers that you're working with. So it's important that we give as much accuracy to what we're trying to look for. And so if we look at the different vectors at which data can move throughout the environment, just a brief overview of our solutions. If we're looking at something in motion, that could be an email going out to an outbound client on the external side of your network, as well as some sort of web post as some sort of either a cloud repository or some sort of website that you're uploading something to. There's even things with instant messaging that we can do. If we're talking data at rest, that could be information that's in some sort of database, file share, or even the actual end workstation that the user might be managing from. And then different things with data in use, if you're plugging into a USB or printing or copying and pasting. These are all different ways that we want to try to detect data. But if we're not actually focusing on the actual classification, that's where if we don't get that right, then all the other different vectors won't really matter much. So it's important that we get that beginning point to be as accurate as possible. And so if we look at how do we establish some sort of DLP program, typically I'm talking with the security teams most often. And so I always try to encourage them to bring in other teams within their organization if they're just going about starting a practice with DLP. And so that could be different people from HR. So if we're talking certainly your own your own employee data, what sort of things should we be looking at? What sort of things should we be recording as evidence? Is there anything to be mindful of? And that might even involve people from your legal departments as well. And then other different parties, if you have these different entities inside your organization, might be from compliance, even the privacy team, but also the actual data owners. Those are the people that would be managing some of that sensitive data, whether it's intellectual property, maybe there's special formulas that you're generating that is IP within your organization. So they would have a good grasp on how to best classify that data, or just the people that could be DBAs that could tell you what sort of fields that might be important that are in a database, or some other healthcare or PII information. So leveraging all these different parties together to come with a cohesive strategy of, hey, what should that data look like, and then what do we do when we find matches, and what sort of implication should we be putting onto our users that are managing that. So that's all going to kind of work together to make your strategy more mature. And then, of course, if you need a little bit of assistance with that and getting started, we offer our own services around that through our Foundstone group. So a good example is if you're looking to just understand kind of what are the basics to get started, we have a workshop that we can come on site and help you with, as well as some other customizations that we can do. So if we get into our ePolicy Orchestrator, that's essentially how we manage the solution for either our endpoint DLP or our network DLP. And so anybody that's probably used this before, some of these menu buttons will look a little bit familiar. And the ones that we're going to be focusing on specifically are around the classification. So that's where we create the actual object for a classification and then reference any sort of definitions or things like advanced patterns or regular expressions or dictionary terms. Those get all built into the classification engine. Another area of focus would be the DLP incident manager. So that's when some sort of event has been triggered, right? So we've matched the classification for a certain vector, like an outbound email or a web post. And so then we're looking at that incident and looking at the different details to take action on. Is it a false positive? Is it something that we need to escalate, et cetera? And then the actual DLP policy manager is where we're going to be constructing rules and rule sets. So a given rule might be email, web, cloud. A rule set can be a conglomeration of those together. And then, in certain cases, you might have multiple rule sets, and we'll kind of talk about why you might do that. And so here I've gone into DLP Policy Manager. In the top right, I've kind of put the EPO logo that you would find each of these different screenshots under. So as a reference, if you're playing along at home, you can kind of revisit some of this as well. And so if we drill into a specific rule set, in this case, the regulatory rule set is what I've called it. You can see the different rules that I've defined, right? So I have different cloud repositories, perhaps, maybe email, printing, removable storage, etc. And then I'm going to drill into a specific rule for email, and then that's going to expand upon the different condition, exception, and reactions that a specific rule would have. Now, for today's discussion, we're focusing specifically on classifications, and so that would be what classification are we actually trying to match on, right? So in this case, in my rule, I have PCI, HIPAA, and PII all in the same rule. And that's not necessarily required. You could split them out if you wanted to take different reactions on one versus another. But really, what is that actual logic that defines a classification is our focus. And so to go about creating a classification, you'd simply choose the EPO menu button. In the bottom right, there'll be an option to create a new classification. You'll provide the name for what that classification should be referenced for, whether it's in your DLP policy manager for your rules or when you're looking at incidents for that classification. So typically you want to be somewhat accurate. You don't want an extremely long line of 40 plus characters. Just clear and concise is probably best practice. Then the next thing you'll do is you'll add what's called a content classification criteria. And you can have multiples of those depending on how many different types of logic that you want to have that matches for that given classification. And so I'll kind of walk through one example of making a classification criteria and then different ways that you could complement and enhance that for basically to make it more qualified for what you're looking for. Just another slide here. After you make that classification criteria, you're going to give that a name as well. And then you're going to have the ability to choose what that logic will be. So if we look, there's different types of things here on the right. We have data conditions. So those are going to be things that are within the text of what we're searching for. So advanced pattern is our way of saying regular expression. We also have dictionaries that are predefined, but you can also create and import your own. Keywords are just like a short list of static words if you just want to do that instead of a dictionary. And then proximity kind of leverages the three things above to find, in this case, you could have an advanced pattern within so many characters of a dictionary term, and that could be your match. Down below, you'll also see that we have file conditions, so that could be some sort of document property, whether the file is encrypted or not, some sort of extension it might have, different file information like the size or the owner or when it was last modified. We can leverage some third-party tags as well. So if you're familiar with Titus as one of our partners, so if they're already classifying a document, we can certainly integrate into that. As well as the true file type, which is like what is the file actually like a type of, like is it audio, is it text? So it's a little bit more granular than say a file extension. So speaking to some of those data elements, I'm just going to show a few simple examples that are built into the product. So if we're talking about tax identification numbers, the Social Security number would be one that's built in with the product, as well as if we're talking debit cards, obviously Visa, MasterCard, American Express, some of the routing, banking, financial information. If we go to dictionaries, we have a good example is our most common U.S. family names. And so, you don't necessarily have to use that. You could use a subset of that. You could certainly make your own if you wanted to list out all your different employee names or all your different employee IDs. If they have, maybe it's a letter followed by 6 digits. If you wanted to put all those specific things and use that in some form or fashion. Also, we have some of the payment card industry terms, and we have many different healthcare dictionaries that you're welcome to use. So in this first use case, I'm going to go about building a classification for PII, and I'm going to start at the very basic level and then progress to make it a little bit more intelligent along the way. The reason being, I've run into a lot of customers that simply are just looking for a 9-digit number, and they call us up and say, hey, the product works in some instances, but I notice I get a lot of false positives. How do I go about making that a little bit better? And the first thing I usually ask is, well, can you show me an incident that is a false positive and tell me why it is? And then we immediately get down to what that classification is, what it's looking for, and the aha moment comes, and they're like, well, oh, that makes sense. If I'm just looking for a 9-digit number, if some HTML form that I'm posting just has that embedded into the coding of the web page, of course that's going to trigger, right? So how do we make that a little bit more intelligent? One thing that we can do is a thresholding of that. So rather than just seeing one 9-digit number, we can see, let's say, 3 or 5. In this case is the example in number 2. That works to some extent, but an even better approach is to look for some sort of name or some other element in conjunction with a 9-digit number. And so in this case, we're going to look at, let's say you're uploading a file. If there's a common U.S. name, and again, this dictionary could be like your customer names, and then you also have a 9-digit number, then as long as both of those things happen, then we actually have a match. It's not just a 9-digit number. Now we can even take that a step further to say, hey, I need to see 3 9-digit numbers with 3 of the names of my dictionary. And then we can even enhance that even more to say, hey, well, I want to have a 9-digit number, but that 9-digit number needs to be somewhat close to the actual name, because I don't want some inclusion of the name triggering it when it's on a totally different page of a document that it might not even be relevant. So why don't we add the element of proximity into the picture? So in this case, we're looking for that 9-digit number with the dictionary term, and they need to be within 25 characters in this example. And then I have to have 3 occurrences of that situation happening. And again, that 25 characters, that can be customized as well as the 3 times. So you can make that 50 characters and 10 times if you want. And so I can even take this a step further. I think I'm using 50 characters, but not only am I looking for that situation like in step 5, but now I'm looking for another dictionary to also be present that's relating to terms that are synonymous with Social Security. So maybe the word SSN shows up as well, or Social Security shows up, as well as having the 9-digit number in proximity to the last name happening 3 times. So we've now gone from a 9-digit number to something infinitely more complex, and so the assumption is that our false positive rate should go much further down, but also the incidents we're getting, that quality goes up, so they're much more actionable. And if you're not using Social Security numbers, we can certainly leverage other account numbers and patterns. In this case, I made a dummy Acme account number is what I called it. And so this could be some sort of regex that you had in your environment that's unique to your unique way of identifying people. So just kind of a simple snippet here, I'm using essentially a capital letter followed by 12 digits. So if you had a different pattern, maybe it's 3 letters and 9 digits or what have you, you can totally import that yourself. Another example, so if you're protecting healthcare information, just kind of showing how we can and or things together. You'll notice that in this first example, if we have either an account number or a Social Security number, and we have some term matching from either of the 2 dictionaries I've defined, then we'll have a match. So maybe we're using different types of numbers at the same time. Maybe we're using Social Security numbers, but alternatively, if that customer has changed to a more secure option, perhaps you just added that in the last year. So they might have transferred over their Social Security number to use some other 10-digit number that is unique to your entity, your organization. So you're not sure which one it could be, depending on whether the client, when they came on board, or maybe there's some sort of merger and acquisition. So you have a reason to look at a couple different types of numbers, but we can support that kind of logic as well. In this case, I've taken that same approach, but I've also added the element of, say, a date. So if we're looking at some sort of healthcare statement or report or imaging or diagnosis, there might be a good chance that that happened on a certain date, right? So if we're not seeing date terms, perhaps that means that it's unclassified. Again, that would be something that would be up to your organization to determine, like when is something actually for what type of data you're looking for. Does it have to have a date or not? Just having some random number and a term might not mean anything if whatever the situation could be. But just to show you that you can combine all these different elements together. And then I take it one step further where I'm looking for different types of account numbers with the date, with the different dictionary terms, as well as, hey, I want to have that common last name that I'm also looking for. So a lot of different things going on, but it just goes to show how complex you can make your logic to kind of get to what you're truly focusing on. And so we've made this a little bit easier over probably the last 6 months to a year. So importing terms can sometimes be a little problematic, especially if you're talking about 5,000 terms in a dictionary. So we've added the ability to actually import this. So you're no longer having to copy and paste and worry about whether you have duplicates or replacing or whatnot. The actual CSV will take care of that for you. So in my example, I just have the different states within the United States, and then you just simply click the import entries and load in your CSV file. One tip or trick is if you're trying to figure out the formatting that the columns need to have, if you just do a quick export and then put in your data, that's usually a good guide to get you started with that. And so one other way that we've helped to make that automation even better is we've added a REST API. So the reason that you might want to do something like this is if you have some sort of dictionary terms that are changing on some sort of interval basis, maybe every week you have employees that are either being fired or they're quitting, as well as new people coming on board, and you want to keep that list up to date on an automated basis. So if you're able to export that CSV into some sort of location, you could essentially script a way to import that into your classification. So I have this REST dictionary on the Linux prompt up above. It's got a couple of different gambling, poker terms and whatnot. And so I have a Python script that was running. It basically injects that into EPO, and you can see baccarat, bankroll, best odds, all the different terms that were on the left up above get imported into that. And so I could just make a cron job if I wanted to look for that certain file and then script that out. And then as things change, that gets applied to EPO, and then as policies, either your endpoints or your network devices check in for policy updates, once that's been applied in EPO, they can go and fetch that and get that updated list. And to learn a little bit more about that, we've written a KB article, and there's some examples about how to get started with that. So that's KB 87855. Okay, so I'm going to move from some of the data conditions to how we can do things around file conditions. And so the first one is just a simple example with a file extension. So if you wanted to write something to classify Visio documents, and maybe you're concerned about the documents being stored on your network share, and that any documents that are Visio need to be in a specific location, but you're not necessarily sure that your users are following that rule. Not too difficult. You just basically make your Visio file extensions and then define them, and then you would just relate that to your classification as the file information that you're using, and then essentially you'd write that rule to go and scan for that classification, and it's going to look for, in this case, VSDX, VSD, VDX, and then it can report on where those files are. Depending on, if you're doing this on the host or even the network, you could even move some of those files over to that destination location that they need to reside in. And you can even leave a placeholder file to let users know that their file was moved and why. Another good use case that sometimes people run into is trying to protect data that could be encrypted, but at the same time, it's great that it's encrypted, but what about DLP inspection? And so if somebody goes and takes an Excel file and does a password protect and wants to upload it to somebody to bypass some sort of control, or they think they're doing the right thing, maybe that's not how your process should work. They should be doing it through some other manner. So we can actually write a way to actually look at encrypted files, and then we can essentially say, hey, if something matches that classification, we can actually take a rule and block that. And so, dear Mr. User, if you're matching any of the different types of encryptions, we're actually going to configure a rule to block you, and then put a notification that says, this was blocked because, X, Y, and Z. You can refer them to an HTML link and say, this is the policy of why you're getting blocked. Of course, if that user actually needs to be given access, you could go ahead and exempt them in some sort of Active Directory group. But certainly this would be a way to make sure that things like this aren't going on. So one more example here. So if we're looking at file information attributes, that could be something like a data access, created, modified, the name of the file, as well as who might have created it, the owner, and the size. So just using a simple example of a combination of these, if I wanted to make a file size that's greater than 100 megabytes, perhaps it's been modified in the last 7 days, and let's give it an extension of .zip. So it's just as simple as this. So why might I want to do this kind of classification? Well, perhaps, again, we're going back to like a discovery use case. If you're trying to look for people that are putting abnormally large zip files out on the network share for whatever reason, maybe you have some business case for looking at this types of data. Just know that the product can do this sort of thing. And, you can also combine some of these elements with some of the data conditions as well. So if somebody has social security numbers and last names and whatnot with that logic that we had before, and that's in a text document, and that text document's greater than 10 megabytes. Why are they mass exporting that much data to their USB, right, or whatever the vector could be? So I mean, these are just some of the creative ways you can make classifications to help discover why people are doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing, and to help kind of coach them and guide them to doing more sensitive, having a better way to handle that sensitive data. So we've talked about all the different ways that you can classify data, but kind of where the rubber meets the road is in seeing what those incidents generate. And so in this case, I had some test data that I ran through over on the right. So we had some account numbers and names, addresses, and social security numbers. And so a couple things that we were able to do here, right? So you can see that this was a cloud protection rule. So somebody was trying to move a file to OneDrive. The first thing I'm going to point out is the evidence. So we can actually download a copy of that file that was actually attempted to be egressed. And so that's actually encrypted in an evidence share. So it's not like somebody can come and manipulate the file. It's only openable or accessible through EPO. But it allows you to kind of see like what was truly uploaded, and did our classification hit the mark or not. Kind of a shortcut way of doing that is through the match count. So if you actually click the match count 10, you'll get a little pop-up in a new tab, and then it can kind of tell you what logic was triggering, right? So the highlighting is kind of built into the product. So, oh yeah, we see a name, we see social security. Yep, it looks like some sort of table of data for somebody, right? That probably was sensitive information. So it just kind of helps to, like, a short way to confirm that you're doing something and finding it accurately. A couple other things to pay attention to are the classifications. So you can also see that through this first sub-menu under the evidence where it says PII. There's a couple other ways that you could see this. So if I moved over to a different tab here, so first I'm pointing out the rule set name and the rule name, and then also the classifications if I move over to another tab. Why is this important? Well, if you're trying to actually go about tuning something, right, like let's say it's not actually hitting the mark, well, that's how you know which classification to go and edit and maybe increase your thresholds or whatever the case may be. But if there are approved users that should be doing this and maybe they haven't been approved yet, well, which rule do you have to go and add an AD group to? That's kind of where the rule name would be important and what rule set. So these are just a couple other elements to keep in mind as you're tuning. And so, you could either do that through the condition, like I only want the rule to match for these users, or I want the rule to match for everybody. So kind of in the bottom right, so that would be an exception. And I don't really have the screenshot expanding that, but you certainly have the flexibility to do that there. So my 3 takeaways, if you're telling me that you have a high rate of false positives, it's generally an indication that maybe your way of classifying needs a little bit of improvement. So looking at things like your incidents, and if you're able to take evidence and some of the match count to see how your logic is corresponding. If you're just looking for a 9-digit number, you're inevitably going to have a lot of false positives. So taking some of the suggestions I've provided today, looking at ways to kind of true that up to maybe make that a little bit more intelligent. It's also important that if you're not already doing this already, to have corporate participation. So just because you're managing the solution doesn't mean that all the different policies and classifications should be up to you to define. So leveraging your manager and even your CISO all the way up up the chain to bring in other parties to protect sensitive data, because nobody wants to be breached. Nobody wants to have to lose customers over something that's handled improperly. So obviously having that corporate-wide participation is in everybody's best interest. And then obviously refining classifications. It's not a set it and forget it. It's definitely a continuous effort. You're going to have new vectors emerging tomorrow. I mean, the big one today is with cloud and more companies putting data into the cloud, and how do we define and accurately protect around that, and who knows what tomorrow will bring. Plus, our companies are constantly changing. We might have different types of business lines that are opening up that bring in different types of data. If you start selling a certain product and you take payment card information now, that's a PCI is now a big thing in your case. So it's important to kind of keep on what your data security practice should be, and then look for maybe there's new classifications you need to start incorporating and then enforcing with DLP. So Jeff, I kind of wanted to kick it back to you to see if there's any questions that maybe we could answer, and I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. Yeah, there are a few came through here on the chat and then the Q&A. So the first one is, in your opinion, is it better to build out a rule set first or define the classification first?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of bring up a quick slide. So the way I would answer that is it's definitely more important to get the classifications accurate, kind of like this was articulating. So if you go about trying to create a whole bunch of rules with predefined classifications, you might just get inundated with noise and get a little bit frustrated. So trying to work maybe just in like at one rule at a time in a specific machine that you're testing with, or maybe you have some sample data from those different parties within your organization. Let's get the classifications accurate. And then once you know that classification's trued up, then you can go about building out, email protection, web protection. It's pretty much like a plug and play after that.
Great. Another one here. Once we have the classifications defined, what sort of progression should we go through to start detecting sensitive data?
Yeah, so if you're just starting out with DLP and you're looking to start enforcing because you have your classifications, you have your rule sets built out, most of the time people don't want to start stopping their users from doing their job. They kind of want to do a little bit of a discovery to see what they're doing. So generally how I guide folks is to first kind of do a monitor only and kind of mask any sort of notification that we could choose to elect to show. So essentially, you'll just be reporting incidents into EPO and maybe even recording evidence. But any sort of notification that, hey, this was sensitive, we're going to block this or monitor it, et cetera, that would probably be maybe more in a phase 2 where you start coaching the user that, hey, this is sensitive information, this should be going out through this vector, or maybe some sort of policy. That would be like a next step that I would guide people. And then maybe the third way would be, once you're starting to coach your users, I kind of like the request justification because it gives them the option to understand that something's sensitive and they can cancel out of it. But at the same time, if it is business approved, they can choose some sort of justification reason to do that. So I kind of recommend that first, but also if you wanted to get into a fourth progression, I guess you could go to outright blocking. So if there's certain things that people should never be posting to, that's kind of where you would do that last as far as your implementation.
Great. Let's see, what else do we have here? Here's another one. Within McAfee EPO, you can define multiple rule sets and multiple policies that get applied to the endpoint. Our environment simply has a single rule set assigned to a single policy. Can you explain the reasons for creating multiple sets of either?
Right. Yeah. So, by its nature, when you create, DLP, install DLP into EPO, you'll have one default policy that maps to your different users in your system tree. I'm just looking for a quick slide where I can kind of show what I'm going to do here. So in this example, I'm only showing 2 different rule sets, but one reason why you'd want to split out into 2 different ones is if you have a reason to apply different types of rules for a different geographical region or a different business unit. So you're going to map a rule set to an actual policy. And so I don't have it pictured here, but if you click the policy assignment, you'll basically have that matrix. And a policy will be a column, and a rule set will be a row. And you can basically checkbox which of the rule sets you want to apply to each policy. And so if, for instance, I always use Germany as an example, there's certain rules and regulations that they can't do certain monitoring for their employees, but maybe in the United States it's acceptable and you're going to go about doing it that way. So that would be a good example of, the U.S. might have one rule set, Germany might have a different one, and then the U.S. one's applied to column 1, let's say, and then the Germany one's applied to column 2. And the same can be said if you have different business units where certain users are under different scrutiny than other folks might be, right? So that would be probably the biggest reason why to split that out.
Okay. Does the number of rules impact performance, or are there any best practices for how many rules would be okay in an environment like this?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the more you add to anything, whether it's dictionary terms or rules, I mean, at some point, things do start to degrade, right? So, generally speaking, I see most people seem to accomplish things in like a dozen or 2 dozen rules. I think if you're getting beyond like 50 or 100 rules, that's probably larger in an environment, but you might have a valid reason to do so, especially when we go back to the comment about splitting out for different geographical reasons. So like you need to have that many rules. But if there's commonalities where it's different groups that all have the same reaction, and you could just plug in multiple AD groups or multiple classifications into the same type of rule because they're all going to be request justification, then I would look for reasons to group them. Another example is that maybe there's similar vectors, so you're going to have just one removable storage rule and then have all the different things that are going to match into that. I've seen some people that'll do a rule set per vector, and it's just an easier way to organize the rules. But I think from a total term count, I mean, if you're having to put 40,000 terms into one dictionary, are you really gaining that much more with that marginal difference where, could you get 80% of that with 10,000, right? So at what cost do you want to put on the burden on your endpoint for what marginal difference? So I would say, like, think about those things and do some testing to figure out what makes the most sense for you. At the end of the day, DLP is meant to mitigate risk. If it could stop everything, it would be a silver bullet, and I'd be a billionaire by now. So try to figure out where that balance is.
So I guess the key is it's an iterative process, and it's not a set and forget technology, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation as far as recording evidence goes? That's the last question I've got here on the chat right now.
Yeah, so I know that there's some customers that maybe get a little concerned that they're recording actual files, especially if it could be something personal to a user. But generally speaking, that's the best way to figure out if your classifications are matching. And keep in mind that those files are encrypted, so they're not necessarily, you can control who has access to EPO to be able to see those files. So there are mitigating controls, so not anybody can just go and pick up that file from an evidence share. So I would generally recommend people to use evidence, and then it gives them insight into what they're truly matching. Maybe if you're kind of on the fence of it, maybe just do it initially, and then once you have confidence in your classifications, then you can go about doing that. But once you turn that off, you're not going to really have a great way of knowing if something was legit or not. So, that's kind of the catch-22 with that.
Sure. Well, you mentioned, you did mention encryption. I see one other note here. What about DLP with regard to encrypted files? How do you deal with that? How do customers typically deal with that?
So if they're sending an encrypted file, or they want to actually encrypt as a reaction, because we can do a couple different things.
Well, how about both? Since I'm not sure from the question here.
Okay, so if they're actually sending an encrypted file, and you're concerned that that file might leak out, we can certainly make a classification on those different types of encryption to stop that file from going out, and provide a notification to the user that they need to decrypt it or unlock the file so we can do the inspection. Now, if there's a concern with this is a sensitive file, and we want to allow the user to put it on a USB and take it home, for whatever business justification or reason, we have a solution called File and Removable Media Protection that we can interface with. In the case of USB, we can do that a couple different ways. We can fully encrypt the drive, or we can just encrypt that specific file that's triggered from a DLP rule. So if it matches a certain classification, the encryption would happen on that specific file. The user can then take it with them. And so if they had to, for whatever reason, take it to somebody else that also had our McAfee FRP with those keys to unlock it, they could. But if they tried to put it on some unmanaged system, they wouldn't be able to get into that file because they wouldn't have the keys. So I guess it depends on that use case, and we can also do that file level encryption with DLP for like a cloud protection rule and network share protection. So if somebody's moving something to a location in the cloud or a network share, we can encrypt as well.
Great. I'm not seeing anything else here on the chat or the Q&A, so I think we're done.
Okay. Well, again, hopefully this was helpful for the people that attended or the people that might be watching this on the recording. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you very much.